It all started a few months ago when my wife Jessica and I moved into what we thought was our dream home in a small town in Illinois. It was an old Victorian-style house built in the late 1800s with a sprawling porch and intricate woodwork that whispered of its rich history. We got it for a steal, which should have been the first red flag, but we chalked it up to our good fortune and the charm of small-town living. The first week in the house was uneventful. We spent our days unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, laughing at how much stuff we'd managed to accumulate over the years. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. It began subtly. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. At first, I thought it was Jessica, but every time I checked, she'd be sound asleep beside me. I convinced myself it was the creaking of the old wooden floors settling, though deep down, I knew it was something more. One evening, while Jessica was out running errands, I was in the living room assembling a bookshelf. I'd been hammering away for what felt like hours when I heard a loud thud upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I called out, thinking maybe Jessica had come back without me noticing, but there was no answer. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a wrench, and made my way upstairs. The sound seemed to have come from the guest bedroom. As I opened the door, the room was empty, but the chair we'd placed by the window was toppled over, and the curtains swayed as if someone had brushed past them. The window was locked from the inside. Jessica returned home shortly after, and I decided not to tell her about the incident. I didn't want to scare her or make her think I was losing my mind. But from that night on, the activity escalated. Objects began moving on their own. A mug I'd left on the kitchen counter would turn up in the sink. Lights would flicker at odd times, even though the wiring had been inspected before we moved in. One night, as we sat watching TV, the chandelier in the dining room started swinging back and forth violently, even though all the windows were shut. Jessica was the first to admit that she felt uneasy in the house. She mentioned hearing faint whispers when she was alone, almost as if someone was standing just behind her. I dismissed it as her imagination until I started hearing them too. They weren't words exactly, just soft, incomprehensible murmurs that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, I woke up to find Jessica sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the doorway. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her breathing was shallow. "Jess?" I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She flinched as if I'd shocked her, then turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "There's someone in the hallway," she said. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. The hallway was empty, of course, but as I stood there, I felt an icy chill pass through me, so cold it made my teeth chatter. Jessica refused to go back to sleep that night, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. The breaking point came a few weeks later. We just returned home from dinner with friends when we found the front door wide open. Every light in the house was on, and the temperature inside was freezing, despite it being a warm summer night. As we stepped inside, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pushing down on us. Then we saw it. On the wall in the living room, written in what looked like ash, were the words, "Get out!" Jessica screamed, and I felt my stomach drop. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was a cruel prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was in this house wanted us gone. We spent that night in a hotel. The next morning, I called a local historian to learn more about the house. What he told me sent shivers down my spine. The house had belonged to a family in the early 1900s who had mysteriously vanished without a trace. Over the years, subsequent owners reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, objects moving, and even sightings of shadowy figures. Most didn't stay longer than a few months. Desperate, we brought in a priest to bless the house. He walked through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. For a while, things seemed to quiet down, and we thought maybe we'd finally found peace. But then the dreams started. Every night, I dreamed of a man standing at the foot of our bed. He wore old-fashioned clothes, and his face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. He never spoke, just stood there, staring. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. One night, Jessica woke up screaming, saying she'd seen the same man standing in the corner of the room. That was it. We couldn't stay another night in that house. We packed up whatever we could fit in our car and left, vowing never to return. We sold the house at a loss, not caring about the money. We just wanted to be free of it. To this day, I don't know exactly what was in that house. A ghost? A demon? Something else entirely? All I know is that it was real, and it was angry. I still have nightmares sometimes, and every so often I wake up feeling that same icy chill as if it's followed me. I've learned one thing from the experience. Sometimes a house is cheap for a reason.
Story number 2.
It happened when I was in my early 30s. My husband Ethan and I had just moved to a small, picturesque town in New Hampshire. We were looking for a fresh start, and when we stumbled upon a sprawling colonial-era house at a ridiculously low price, we thought we'd hit the jackpot. The house was beautiful in a haunting way. It sat on several acres of dense woods, with ivy crawling up its weathered walls and a creaky wraparound porch. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find on a postcard or in a ghost story. But we weren't superstitious, and the charm of it overshadowed any sense of unease. For the first few weeks, it was peaceful. Ethan and I spent our days fixing up the house and exploring the woods. But soon little things began happening. It started with noises, soft tapping on the walls, the sound of footsteps in the attic, even though we never went up there. Ethan joked that it was just the house settling. I wanted to believe him, but there was something about the sounds that felt deliberate. One night, I was home alone while Ethan was working late. I was curled up on the couch, flipping through a book, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My heart raced as I froze in place, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time louder, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps on the floor above me. I grabbed the fireplace poker and tiptoed upstairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the landing, the hallway was empty, but the door to the guest room was wide open. I knew for a fact I'd closed it earlier. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I stepped inside and flicked on the light, but it barely illuminated the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. My gaze fell on the antique mirror we'd found in the basement and decided to use as decor. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement in its reflection, like something had darted past behind me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. I barely slept that night. Things only got worse after that. Ethan started noticing it too. Doors slamming shut on their own, the TV turning on and off randomly, cold spots that seemed to follow us around the house. One evening, as we were having dinner, the chandelier above the dining table began to sway violently, even though there wasn't so much as a breeze. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I'd hear faint murmurs like someone speaking in another room, but the words were never clear, just a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Ethan heard them too and tried to brush it off as wind or the pipes. But deep down, I think he knew it wasn't either of those things. The night that changed everything was one I'll never forget. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when I woke up to the sound of Ethan muttering in his sleep. He was sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide open but glazed over, like he wasn't really there. "Ethan?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. He didn't respond, just kept muttering something under his breath. I leaned in closer and froze when I realized what he was saying. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Suddenly he snapped out of it, blinking as if he'd just woken up from a nightmare. He didn't remember saying anything, but he was drenched in sweat and visibly shaken. The final straw came a week later. We'd invited some friends over for a small housewarming party. Everything was going fine until one of our guests, a woman named Karen, who claimed to be sensitive to paranormal activity, went pale and started trembling. She pointed to the staircase and asked, "Who's the man standing there?" We all turned to look, but the stairs were empty. Karen insisted she saw someone, an older man in period clothing, just standing and watching us. She left shortly after, refusing to step foot in the house again. That night, Ethan and I decided we couldn't stay any longer. As we packed up a few essentials to spend the night at a hotel, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I went to investigate, finding the door to the attic ajar. It had always been locked before. Climbing the narrow staircase, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread. The attic was pitch black and the air was suffocating. In the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of dust-covered furniture, was a wooden rocking chair. It was moving on its own, the creak of the wood echoing in the stillness, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure in the corner, darker than the darkness around it, its head tilted as if watching me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and screamed, bolting down the stairs. Ethan and I left that night and never went back. We sold the house as quickly as we could, though I can't help but feel guilty for passing whatever was there onto someone else. To this day, I don't know what it was. A ghost, a residual energy, or something worse. But I know I'll never forget the oppressive presence of that house. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that shadowy figure in the corner of the attic. And I swear, in the dead of night, I can hear the faint creak of a rocking chair.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of apartment living in New York City, my husband Mark and I decided to take the plunge and buy our first house. We settled on a cozy little place in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. It was a 1950s Cape Cod with just enough charm to make us fall in love, but not so much space that it felt overwhelming. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had lived there for decades. They passed away a few years apart, and their children sold the house to us at a fair price. I remember thinking how peaceful the house felt during the walkthroughs, but now I realize that feeling wasn't peace. It was silence. Watchful, waiting silence. The first strange thing happened within a week of moving in. I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when I heard the sound of shattering glass in the living room. Rushing in, I found one of the picture frames from our wedding lying face down on the floor. The glass was broken, and the frame itself was several feet from where I'd set it on the mantel. Probably just slipped, Mark said when I told him about it that evening. The house is old. Maybe the floors are uneven. I didn't argue, but something about the way the frame had landed didn't sit right with me. A few days later, I was alone in the house while Mark was at work. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard heavy footsteps running down the hall. My first thought was that Mark had come home early, but when I called out, there was no response. Wrapping a towel around myself, I peeked out into the hallway. It was empty. That night, Mark brushed it off again, saying it was probably the pipes or my imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the occurrences became harder to explain away. Lights would flicker randomly, even though the wiring had been inspected before we moved in. Doors would creak open on their own, and the air in the house grew colder, even as the summer heat intensified outside. The scariest part was the basement. From the moment we moved in, I hated going down there. It wasn't just the musty smell or the dim lighting, it was the feeling. Every time I descended the stairs, I felt like I was being watched. Mark didn't feel it, or if he did, he didn't say anything. But I started avoiding the basement whenever I could. One night, as we sat watching TV, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. Mark and I exchanged a look before he grabbed a flashlight and headed to investigate. I followed reluctantly. My stomach knotted with dread. When we reached the basement, we found the source of the noise. One of the storage shelves had toppled over, scattering boxes and old tools across the floor. Mark righted the shelf and muttered something about it being loose, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had pushed it over. Things escalated after that. One night I woke up to find Mark standing at the foot of our bed, staring out the window. His posture was stiff, his breathing shallow. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. I reached out and touched his arm, and he jolted awake, looking at me like I'd just shaken him out of a nightmare. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaky. "I must have been sleepwalking. I was dreaming about, I don't know. Someone was calling me." We both pretended it was nothing, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We were both starting to feel like we weren't alone in the house. The breaking point came about a month after we moved in. I was cleaning out the attic, sorting through the dusty boxes left behind by the previous owners, when I found something strange. Hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers was a wooden box, its surface scratched and worn. Inside, I found a collection of black and white photos, all of the same woman. She had a gaunt face and hollow eyes, and in every picture, she was standing in front of our house. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was a close-up of the woman's face, her lips twisted into a sinister smile. On the back of the photo, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "She watches." That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing outside our bedroom door. Mark heard it too. Grabbing his phone for light, he opened the door, but the hallway was empty. As we stood there, frozen, we heard the basement door creak open on its own. Mark insisted we check it out, though every instinct in me screamed to stay away. As we descended the stairs, the cold hit us like a wall. The basement was pitch black, save for the faint glow of Mark's flashlight. In the center of the room, the wooden box I'd found in the attic was sitting on the floor, though I'd left it upstairs. Its lid was open, and the photos were scattered around it. And then we heard it. a low, guttural laugh coming from the shadows. It was a sound I'll never forget, full of malice and something inhuman. Mark and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We left the house that night and never went back. We sold it as quickly as we could, taking a significant loss just to be rid of it. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it wasn't just haunted, it was evil. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear that laugh echoing in the darkness.
Story number 4.
It began when my wife Clara and I moved into a historic farmhouse in rural Kansas. The house was a picture of rustic beauty, a red barn, rolling fields, and a white picket fence that seemed plucked from a storybook. It had been vacant for years, the owners before us having abruptly moved out and left everything behind. We thought it was an opportunity to create a home and breathe life back into the property, but we didn't realize the life already lingering there. The first sign something was wrong came on our second night. We'd barely begun unpacking, so the rooms were still sparsely furnished. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint humming. It was melodic, almost like a lullaby. I assumed it was Clara, but when I rolled over, she was fast asleep. I got up and walked down the hall, following the sound. It led me to the nursery, a small room we hadn't even opened yet. When I switched on the light, the humming stopped. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair in the corner. It swayed gently, as though someone had just risen from it. I brushed it off as the wind coming through the cracked windows. But deep down, something about it unnerved me. Clara started noticing things too. She said she often felt cold drafts in the kitchen, even when all the windows were shut. Cabinet doors would swing open on their own, and sometimes she'd hear faint whispers when she was alone in the house. I tried to reassure her. It was an old house, after all. Old houses creak, they breathe, they shift. But it wasn't long before we couldn't deny something was happening. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching TV when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Clara grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "You locked the doors, right?" she whispered. I nodded, though my stomach churned with doubt. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The hallway was dark and the air felt heavy. I opened the door to our bedroom, but nothing seemed out of place. As I turned to leave, the closet door creaked open. My flashlight beam landed on a row of empty hangers swaying gently, though there was no breeze. A faint scratching noise came from inside. Summoning what little courage I had, I stepped closer and peered in. The closet was empty. Clara and I started sleeping with the lights on after that. The events escalated over the following weeks. One morning, we found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the living room, even though neither of us had been outside. Another time, Clara swore she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the cornfield, watching the house. When I looked, it was gone. The most chilling moment happened late one night. Clara and I were lying in bed when we heard the sound of a child giggling. It echoed through the house, soft at first, then louder and closer. I shot out of bed and flung open the door, but there was no one there. Then Clara screamed. I turned to see her pointing at the foot of the bed. My blood ran cold. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a little girl. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and she was wearing a tattered white dress. She just stood there, staring at us, unmoving, and then, in an instant, she was gone. We spent the next day researching the house's history. What we found was more horrifying than we could have imagined. In the 1930s, a family of 6 had lived there, a couple and their 4 children. The youngest daughter, Lily, had drowned in the creek behind the house, and shortly after her death, the family began reporting strange occurrences. Neighbors claimed the father became increasingly paranoid, believing Lily's spirit was still in the house. One night, he snapped. He killed his wife and remaining children before taking his own life in the nursery. That evening, Clara and I decided we couldn't stay another night. We packed a few essentials and left. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a pale figure standing on the porch, watching us leave. We sold the house without returning, taking only what we could carry. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear faint humming or the soft sound of footsteps. I just hope whatever was in that house stayed behind.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be the perfect home for my husband, Derek, and me, a quaint craftsman-style house nestled at the edge of the woods in Oregon. We were both nature lovers, and the thought of living surrounded by towering pines and chirping birds felt like a dream come true. The house itself was charming but old. It had been vacant for years, the realtor told us, as the previous owners had abruptly left. They didn't give a reason. I wish I'd asked more questions. From the first night, something felt off. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed too intentional. We chalked it up to being away from the city's constant hum, but the unease grew. The first incident happened while I was unpacking in the kitchen. I reached for a box on the counter when I felt something brush against my arm. A light, almost playful tug. Thinking it was Derek, I turned around, but no one was there. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then the tapping began. It started as soft knocks, like someone gently rapping on the walls. They always came at night, seeming to move from room to room. Derek thought it might be a bird or small animals outside, but the knocks always sounded like they were coming from inside the house. One night, as we lay in bed, the knocking grew louder. It seemed to come from the attic. Derek decided to check it out, grabbing a flashlight and heading up the narrow staircase. I waited at the bottom, my heart racing. He was gone for what felt like forever, and when he finally came back down, his face was pale. "There's nothing up there," he said, his voice tight, "but the air, it feels wrong." After that, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners. I started waking up in the middle of the night to the feeling of someone watching me. Once, I even heard faint breathing near my ear. Then there were the dreams. They began about a month after we moved in, vivid, horrifying nightmares. In them, I'd find myself in the woods behind the house, standing in front of a large, moss-covered tree. There was always a woman there, her back turned to me. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands, and her dress was soaked and muddy. When she turned around, her face was always the same, pale, hollow, with black pits where her eyes should have been. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Derek started having the same dreams, though he refused to talk about them. The breaking point came on a stormy night. We were sitting in the living room trying to distract ourselves with a movie when the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. And that's when we heard it, a voice, soft and whispery, coming from the hallway. "Help me." I froze, my heart hammering. Derek grabbed my hand, and together we crept toward the sound. The voice grew louder as we approached the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as we pushed it open, the voice stopped. The bathtub was full of murky water, even though neither of us had filled it. Floating on the surface was a single, withered rose. Derek turned to me, his face ashen. "We need to leave. Now." We packed whatever we could carry and left that night, driving to a nearby motel. The next day, we contacted a paranormal investigator desperate for answers. She came to the house with her team and spent hours inside asking questions and taking readings. When she emerged, she looked shaken. "There's something here," she said. "It's tied to the woods and to the house. A woman drowned herself in the creek decades ago. She's searching for someone and she's angry." We sold the house as quickly as we could, taking a huge loss just to get away. I don't know if the new owners have experienced anything, and frankly, I don't want to know. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear her voice, faint and pleading. "Help me. Help me."
Story number 6.
When my fiancée Rachel and I found the house, we thought it was a steal. A Victorian-style home built in the late 1800s, complete with a wraparound porch and intricate woodwork. It sat on the outskirts of a quiet town in Maine, surrounded by dense forest. The price was suspiciously low, but we were assured it was just because the house had been on the market for so long. We should have asked why. The first few days were uneventful as we settled in, but Rachel started noticing odd things almost immediately. She said she felt cold spots in certain areas, even though the heating system worked fine. I told her it was just drafts. An old house like this was bound to have them. She wasn't convinced. A week after we moved in, I heard it for the first time. I was in the kitchen late at night, getting a glass of water, when I heard the faint sound of a piano playing. It was soft, almost delicate, as if someone was lightly running their fingers over the keys. The sound seemed to come from the parlor, where an old, out-of-tune piano had been left by the previous owners. When I went to check, the room was empty, the piano untouched. I told Rachel about it the next morning, expecting her to laugh it off, but instead she looked uneasy. "I thought I heard a woman humming last night," she said. "I thought it was just my imagination." Things escalated quickly after that. Doors began slamming shut on their own, often when Rachel and I were in different parts of the house. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of our vision, and we started finding objects in places we hadn't left them. A picture frame of us from our engagement party fell from the mantel one day, shattering into pieces. But the worst was the basement. From the moment we moved in, Rachel refused to go down there. "It feels wrong," she said. I didn't understand what she meant until I ventured down to fix a circuit breaker. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and it felt like I was being watched the entire time. In the far corner of the basement, I noticed a section of the wall that didn't match the rest. It looked newer, as if it had been hastily patched up. I made a mental note to inspect it later, but I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't want to scare her. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to find Rachel standing at the foot of the bed, her back to me. Her breathing was shallow, and she was muttering something under her breath. "Rachel?" I called softly. She didn't respond. I got up and gently touched her shoulder. She turned to me, her eyes wide and filled with terror. "They're in the walls," she whispered. "They're watching." The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. That was the final straw. I decided to break through the patched-up section of the basement wall, convinced that it might explain everything. Armed with a crowbar, I worked for hours, pulling away the layers of plaster and wood. When I finally broke through, a rush of cold air hit me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Behind the wall was a small, bricked-up room. Inside, I found a collection of old, decaying furniture, an antique rocking chair, a small table, and, in the center, a cradle. The cradle was empty, but above it, scrawled on the wall in faded, reddish-brown letters, were the words, "She never sleeps." That night, Rachel woke up screaming, clawing at her arms as if something was grabbing her. When I turned on the lights, there were scratches running down her forearms, deep, angry welts that hadn't been there before. We packed our bags and left the house that night, staying at a motel until we could figure out our next move. We later learned that the house had a dark history. In the early 1900s, a woman who had lost her infant daughter went mad and sealed herself in the basement, where she eventually died. People claimed her spirit lingered, searching for her child. We sold the house for a fraction of what we paid, warning the new owners of its history. They didn't believe us. I can only hope they've had better luck, or that they left before it was too late. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night or the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear the faint sound of a piano playing.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of city living, my husband James and I moved to an old farmhouse in Indiana. The house had been built in the early 1900s, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles. It was isolated, peaceful, and exactly what we thought we needed. But the house had secrets. From the moment we stepped inside, I felt uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just a heavy, oppressive feeling that made the air seem thicker than it should have been. James didn't notice, or at least he didn't say anything. He was thrilled about the space and the charm of the old architecture. The first night, as we unpacked boxes, I heard a faint thumping noise coming from upstairs. It sounded rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door in slow, deliberate intervals. I froze, looking up at the ceiling. James shrugged it off, saying it was probably the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the thumping became more frequent. Sometimes it was soft and distant. Other times it was loud enough to wake us from sleep. It seemed to move, coming from different parts of the house at different times. James tried to find the source, but there was nothing. No loose pipes, no rodents, no explanation. Then came the laughter. I was alone one afternoon, folding laundry in the living room, when I heard it. A high-pitched giggle, like a child playing a game of hide-and-seek. It echoed faintly, coming from upstairs. My heart sank as I realized the sound was coming from one of the bedrooms, the one we hadn't touched yet. I crept upstairs, my hands trembling. The door to the unused bedroom was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the laughter stopped. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of furniture left behind by the previous owners. In the corner was an old wooden rocking horse. It swayed gently, as if someone had just been riding it. I ran downstairs and waited for James to come home, too afraid to stay in the house alone. Things only got worse from there. Objects began moving on their own. Doors would open and close, sometimes slamming shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Lights flickered constantly, and the air always felt icy cold, no matter how high we turned up the heat. One night, we found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the staircase. They were small, like those of a child, and they stopped abruptly at the top step. Neither James nor I could explain it, especially since it hadn't rained in days. The breaking point came about a month after we moved in. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a lullaby, and it was coming from right next to my side of the bed. I turned on the lamp, but there was no one there. James sat up, groggy and annoyed. "What's wrong?" "Listen," I whispered. The whispering had stopped, but the thumping sound began again. This time it was louder than ever, and it was coming from the basement. James decided to investigate. I begged him not to, but he insisted, grabbing a flashlight and heading downstairs. I followed him reluctantly, clutching his arm as we descended into the dark, damp basement. The thumping grew louder as we approached the far wall. That's when we noticed it, a small door set into the brickwork, half partially hidden behind old storage boxes. It was barely 4 feet tall, with a rusted metal handle. "What the hell is this?" James muttered, reaching for the door. As soon as he touched the handle, the thumping stopped. The silence was deafening. He pulled the door open and a foul stench wafted out, making us both gag. Inside was a narrow, dirt-filled crawlspace. The flashlight beam revealed something buried in the dirt, a small wooden box. James pulled it out, and we opened it together. Inside was a collection of old, faded photographs, all of children. They were posed stiffly, their expressions vacant, and their eyes were wrong. They looked empty, lifeless. At the bottom of the box was a piece of paper, yellowed with age. Scrawled across it in shaky handwriting were the words, "They never left." That night, we packed our bags and drove to a motel. The next day, we contacted a local historian who told us the house had once been an orphanage. It had been shut down in the 1920s after a fire claimed the lives of several children. Some of the bodies were never recovered, and there were rumors that the caretaker had been involved in dark rituals. We sold the house within weeks, refusing to set foot inside again. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear faint laughter or the rhythmic thumping that haunted our dreams. I just pray the children stayed behind.
Story number 8.
It started as a family dream. My wife, Anna, and I had saved for years to buy a home where we could raise our 2 kids, Emily and Ben. The house we chose was a colonial-style beauty in the heart of Connecticut, surrounded by tall oak trees and a sprawling backyard. It was perfect. Too perfect. We moved in during the summer, and for a while, life was good. The kids loved the yard, Anna adored the kitchen, and I was thrilled with the fireplace in the living room. But as we unpacked and settled in, small, strange things began to happen. It started with Emily. She was 6 at the time and loved playing with her dolls. One day she came to me with a frown and said, "Daddy, the girl in my room doesn't like my dolls." I laughed it off, assuming she was talking about an imaginary friend. "What girl?" I asked. "The one with the yellow dress," she said. "She's mean." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was just a child's imagination. Kids make things up all the time, or so I thought. That night, Anna and I were woken up by a loud thud coming from Emily's room. We rushed in to find her sitting up in bed, crying. One of her dolls was lying on the floor, its head twisted backward. "She threw it," Emily sobbed, pointing to the corner of the room. There was no one there. We calmed her down, but neither Anna nor I slept well that night. The next day, I inspected Emily's room, looking for anything that could explain what happened. That's when I noticed it, a faint smell of roses hanging in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was out of place. We didn't own anything with that scent. The activity spread to the rest of the house. Doors would open and close on their own. The TV would turn on to static in the middle of the night. Lights flickered constantly, and sometimes we'd hear faint laughter, childlike and distant. Ben, who was only 3, started pointing at random spots in the house and saying, "The lady," over and over. When we asked him what he meant, he just shrugged and went back to playing. Then there was the basement. The basement door had a heavy latch, which we always kept closed because it was damp and full of cobwebs. One night, as we sat watching TV, the door creaked open on its own. It swung slowly as if someone on the other side was pushing it. Anna and I stared, frozen. When I finally got up to close it, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being watched. I latched the door and prayed it would stay shut. It didn't. The final straw came about 3 months after we moved in. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was one of the kids, but when I checked their rooms, they were both sound asleep. The footsteps continued, heading downstairs. I followed cautiously, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen. When I reached the living room, I saw her. A little girl stood in the middle of the room, wearing a tattered yellow dress. Her hair was dark and matted, and her face was pale and lifeless. She looked at me, her hollow eyes locking onto mine, and then she smiled. Before I could move, she pointed toward the basement door. I ran upstairs, woke Anna and the kids, and we left the house that night. We never went back. We found a rental and sold the house as quickly as we could, telling the realtor we were relocating for work. Months later, I did some digging into the property's history. I discovered that in the early 1900s, a family had lived there. Their youngest daughter, Clara, had fallen down the basement stairs and died. It was said that her spirit lingered, unable to move on. To this day, I can't look at yellow dresses without feeling a chill run down my spine. Sometimes, I still hear her laughter in my dreams.